Hi there, and welcome back. This is the fifth video in a six-part series on modeling for clarity, a workshop from the Understanding Group. I'm Joe Elmendorf. We're going to get right into it and take a look at what happens when we model. Most of the time, before we get to the modeling, we are first exploring something and considering how it works, how the parts relate, what makes it tick. We're taking all of that and we're holding it in our heads. But we're also unconsciously holding the context in our heads, the why and what of the situation around our exploration. Pretty soon, we run out of capacity and we can't remember all the things anymore. Like trying to hold too many apples in your hands, you keep dropping important connections or relationships. When we're modeling, we're taking the things that we've observed and explored about the world, and we're getting them out of our heads and into a model. We're taking our understanding of the how of how things work and how the parts relate and what makes them tick, and we're representing that in a model. Eventually, we get to a point where we have a fully represented understanding of a system, as shown in our model, given our particular intent, of course. We can refer to the model for how things work and function, or for what the parts are, and we no longer need to keep that stuff in our heads. But the context that we unconsciously accumulated along the way, the why and the what behind this model, is the stuff that makes the model meaningful. That stuff still remains in our heads. When we're modeling for ourselves, keeping the why and what of our model in our heads is fine. We are both modeler and audience. We can pick up our model, and as long as it's not been too long, we can quickly reorient ourselves to what we were trying to do with the model and why it was so helpful in the first place. We have a useful model for ourselves that only includes information about how the system functions. The limitations of this kind of function-only model can be seen when we try to share that model with others. Someone who didn't create the model only has a part of the puzzle. We might share the model with them, which explains the function, the how, but we still have the context in our own heads about why this or that matters, or what it's focused on, or how to approach the model. What makes perfect sense to us as the maker might make no sense to our audience because they're missing a key piece, the context. A model that's intended for someone other than the model maker needs to include the context, the what and why of the model, in addition to the function or the how, in order for that model to be useful. Setting up a model for an audience and then tuning it to them throughout the creation and refinement of the model goes a long way towards making the model clear. But we can do more to set our models up for success. In order to do this, we need to figure out how to include the context, that missing piece of the puzzle. When our audience shares a lot of our context, like close colleagues or others that are near to what we're working on, sometimes all the context that's needed is what's contained in the model program placard. Those who are further removed need more intentional context priming methods. The hardest part of creating models for someone else to learn from is successfully imparting the important context for understanding. To help us, we have the context priming series of cards as a starting point. There are likely any number of ways to impart context, but these are four that I find myself using all the time. The first card in the context priming series, the title card, stems from the intent, in that it encapsulates what a model is trying to achieve. It's not uncommon for your title to use different words than your intent, in part due to the added perspective of having gone through the process of making the model, as well as due to a title's need to be tuned for a particular audience. The intent is for you. The title is for your audience. A model's title serves as the first bit of framing for someone coming to a model with fresh eyes. A title shouldn't be complicated. We can include more detail if we need to with the model's narrative, which we'll talk about next, but for now we just need to ask, what is this model doing or showing at the highest level? A title is only helpful if it's accurate, and I tend to favor specific titles over generic ones, simply because generic titles tend to lack much substance. A title is not only a great context priming method, it's also a really important step in the modeling process because it serves as a gut check about whether or not a model makes sense. After I think I've completed a model, I try to give that model a title. If I can clearly and meaningfully title the model, that usually means that the model makes sense. If I can't title a model that I just made, that usually means that I'm trying to do too much in this single model. I'm including too many aspects, or my level of abstraction is all over the place, or I haven't found a truly interesting or meaningful arrangement. The rough process of this title-based gut check is, first, you establish your model program. Then you create a model that delivers on what you intend. Then you title your model, and then compare if your model's title is a good fit with what you initially intended and documented in the model program placard. If we were intending to make a model that clarifies the stakeholder needs of a university website, and the title that best fits our model is Parts of the University Digital Footprint, we might have made a good model, but we probably haven't delivered on our initial intent. Comparing a model's title with the model's program is only helpful if we've created a title that faithfully represents what the model's actually trying to do. This is a moment for you to evaluate the quality of your model. So don't try and fool yourself here. Use this opportunity to reflect and make any needed adjustments before putting your model out into the world. The next card is called narrative. It's as simple as it sounds. A model's narrative is a text description on the model that tells the audience about your intent in creating the model, as well as how you intend the model to be used. A narrative is not a written description of everything that your model is showing. It's not the telling version of your model. It's the framing. A narrative sets up a model so that the audience can know what is and isn't included, as well as the purpose of the model. If I email you a picture, it might be a very clear picture, but if you don't know why I emailed it to you, it'll take you longer to understand, or maybe you'll say, this isn't relevant for me, and trash it. If I email you that same picture, but say, here is an old photo of my house from when we just moved in. It doesn't show the current landscaping, but I just like your thoughts on how much it costs to paint. You now understand why I'm emailing you a picture and what I expect you to do with it. What the narrative isn't doing is providing a text-based description of the picture that I emailed you. It's not saying, Joe's house is a 1.5-story house with asphalt shingles and an unpainted brick facade with dark gray wood siding and non-existent landscaping. A lot of making a clear model is deciding what you can get away with not including, which aspects and which details you can leave out. The narrative provides an opportunity to explain that these occlusions weren't accidental. They just didn't apply given what this model is trying to do. As the model maker, you've been developing the correct frame of mind to make sense of your model the entire time that you've been making it. But your audience is coming to it fresh. How do you help them get the right frame of mind? When we go to write a narrative, we need to look back at our model's intent and figure out if simply copying the intent down onto the model will be understandable to somebody else. Maybe it needs a little rephrasing or expanding upon. Some models are simple enough where they won't need narratives because the title effectively offers up the required framing and setup. Let's look at an example. Here's a model that I made, I want to say in 2016, so it was a few years ago now, and this is just the model, no context priming. If this wasn't a model that I often used as an example while teaching, even I, the one who made it, would have a hard time remembering what this model is doing and why I initially had made it. If we add in a title, we can get a better sense of what's happening in this model. But still, it's it's unclear what this model is supposed to be showing me. If we add in a simple narrative that frames what the model is supposed to be doing, we then have more context. Hopefully, enough context to understand how the model should be interpreted and applied. In a previous video, I mentioned the claim that we only understand something based on what we already understand. By leveraging the form, function, or context of something that somebody already understands in our models, we can increase the speed to and depth of understanding that they can have. We can ask ourselves, is there a higher, more generalized archetypal simplification of this model? Which brings us to our next technique, the metaphor technique. Metaphors are not supposed to be comprehensive analogies. They always break down at some point, and that's fine. The key to using a metaphor successfully is making sure that the metaphor is more accessible, more commonly understood than the subject of your model. If your model is about staplers, and you're talking to a room full of librarians using a metaphor about neuroscience, you're probably not helping anybody. I grew up taking machinery apart and rebuilding cars and making stuff, and so I have a pretty solid understanding of mechanical and electrical systems. I often find myself struggling because I'll be working with information and think, Eureka, I've got it. It's like the viscous coupling in an automatic transmission, or like the firing sequence of an engine, or like some other obscure analogy relating to some complex machinery. And those metaphors might be perfectly suited to the information structures. But unless everybody knows how an automatic transmission is put together, it isn't a good analogy for making the complex clear. Metaphors need to be more accessible than the subject they're being used to describe. I really love this example of a metaphor. It was at the beginning, right after the introduction of a long article about climate change. Up top, we have a color spectrum, and it says, everything that needs to be done about climate change. And then down at the bottom, what you'll read about here. A good metaphor lets us infer things about the subject based on our knowledge of an analogous subject. Based on my understanding of a color spectrum, I can learn about the topics related to what needs to be done about climate change. The things run together. Things are interconnected. You can't comprehensively talk about one thing without talking about all the things. The specificity being shown here is fuzzy because that's what the information needs at this level. We can talk about individual colors on a spectrum in a similar way. We can also see that this article is not going to cover all the things about climate change, but it is going to cover meaningfully differentiated topics across the breadth of potential topics. The metaphor helps us have a better frame for what this article is going to be about based on what we know or can learn simply by looking at this color spectrum-based model. The last context priming technique that we're going to talk about today is the idea of breaking apart a single complex model into smaller chunks as a way to help the audience understand how to read the model. I call this staging. Models often need to be complex because they represent the truth of a complex world. Sometimes we just can't get around that. Sometimes there is just a lot of information that needs to be conveyed. While the whole might be complex, is there a single part, a small isolated chunk of the model that can be easily understood? If you were walking someone through this model, where would you start? Staging a model is about isolating a single piece of information that will be easier for the audience to grasp onto than the whole, and using that as a starting point. We want the audience to understand a small part and then build out the rest of the model from that understanding. So maybe your model is showing a sequence and you need to isolate the beginning of that sequence. Or maybe you can isolate a single piece of your model that's more universally understood by your audience than the rest. So we can say for this example, we're starting at the center. In step one, there's just one thing. So we just focus on the little red dot. Then in stage 2, we see that, okay, now there's the red dot, but there's also this blue thing around it. All right? Stage 3, there's a green thing that builds on it further. And then lastly, you can present the full model that includes all the stages. And now that stages 1, 2, and 3 have been walked through, the audience knows the choreography, the sequence of how they should always approach the model. They know what the intended way to read it is. So we have 4 techniques for priming the context of our model's audience. With the other cards, it was often important to be careful not to mix or be very clear about which side we were choosing. But with context priming, the more techniques you can meaningfully include, the better, especially when your audience does not share much context with you. The last thing I want to touch on in this video is that ever pesky question, but what should it look like? When we're modeling for ourselves, I said that it didn't matter what it looked like, that it'd be beautiful when the relationships were articulated accurately. And I stand by that. But does that still apply when we're modeling with and for others? Well, I've found that the way a model looks does affect how well a model works for others. When creating a model for collaboration and validation with others in real time, it's important that the model doesn't look too good. Models that look finished inhibit collaboration. Participants who might not be the most confident in their ideas might not want to risk messing up a finished-looking model. When I make models that I intend to be collaborated on, I intentionally make them look incomplete, either stylistically or maybe even obviously missing parts as a way to jumpstart that engagement. In collaboration sessions, I'm the first to deface my own model. If it's physical, I'll make a point of crossing something out or making a note with a thick black marker. If it's digital, I'll share it in an editable state and make changes right there on the fly to demonstrate that everything is fluid. Modeling is an exercise in moderation. I can always find ways to make something more clear or more polished. As you get more experience working with others and creating the different models for different situations, you'll develop a sense of what's worth the effort and when to just be finished. Because remember, the model is never the end. It's a means to a different end. Where things change is when you begin to evolve a model into a map. When the play is finished and you've had the conversations and now you need to document things more firmly, our model can start to become a map. When we make our models into maps, it's important to know the way that the map looks affects how authoritative it is seen. When we make our models into maps, we want to harden that ever-changeable modeling medium into something durable and polished that can serve as that mold for making. A highly tweaked and polished map is often more clear and considered more authoritative than one that looks to be slapped together. But of course, it leaves no room for discussion and it doesn't invite argument. But that's all we're going to talk about with maps here, because this workshop's about modeling. In the next video, I'll talk about how to take what we've learned about these cards and apply them to giving and receiving critical feedback about our models from our peers. See you next time.